you can look through the UFC roster and go, he fails the eye test. You know, you look at what's happened to McGregor's brand since he lost to Poirier. Like, it's almost better to ride off into the sunset with that mysticism of, well, he may just have been the best of all time, instead of coming back and maybe proving people that, you know, there is someone better out there that can catch you.
Dan, thanks very much for putting the time away this morning to chat to me. UFC 280, October the 22nd, live on BT Sport Box Office. This is going to be huge. Headlined, of course, by Charles Oliveira against Islam Makhachev. Realistically speaking, in your opinion, how much of a chance does Islam have of coming home with the gold?
You know, the more I've researched it, the more I think his chances are very, very good. You know, Charles Oliveira is a supreme martial artist. You know, striking, jiu-jitsu, he's lethal. You know, submission finisher of the UFC, etc., etc. The thing is, though, we don't tend to see him go much deeper into the fight than the second round. And if I go back into his career and find the losses, find the times when he struggled, it's because he spent all of his energy in the first round trying to finish something and it didn't. And you know, the one that always comes back to mind is his last loss against Paul Felder. Because you think back, Paul Felder was in all kinds of neck problems in that. If he wasn't such a tough individual with such a thick, strong neck, he wouldn't have won that fight. But he was able to last it out, get himself into the second round where he was able to turn the tide. And I can absolutely see that happening in this fight as well, because I think Charles Oliveira will start fast. I think he's going to start aggressive. I think in the first 10 seconds, he's going to be in Makhachev's face, throwing skip knees and overhands and uppercuts and all those kind of things, and trying to catch onto his head and his neck. I also think he's probably going to initiate the first takedown as well, which might be a shock to the system for Makhachev. However, if it doesn't come about in the first round, which it may not because we know how tough Makhachev is, Oliveira might find himself with really heavy arms coming into the second round. And that's where I start to feel like the tide turns for Makhachev. What I wouldn't do if I was Islam is go out there and try and put it on Charles straight away, because you're going to run into a trap. But if you wait and allow him to come to you, burn off that first round of excited energy to try and get his belt back, and then start to slowly grind him down from the second, third, fourth, maybe even to the championship rounds if he needs it, that's probably his best opportunity. And I think it's about as close to a 50-50 fight as we get in a title shot, to be honest.
People are drawing parallels between Conor versus Khabib in the way that people were suggesting that, well, look at Conor striking, and if he catches Khabib, it's going to be lights out. But we all know what happened in that fight. And the fact that Islam has got Khabib in his corner, do you think that's a worthwhile comparison to make?
You know, I think there are some comparisons to make, but this is a very, very different fight. You know, this Charles Oliveira is not Conor McGregor in any way, shape, or form. He is as dangerous with his striking, I would say, as Conor McGregor is, proven now. But it's his jiu-jitsu that backs him up. I mean, 21 submissions, 16 in the UFC. Conor McGregor doesn't have those credentials. He doesn't have the ability to take people down like Charles Oliveira does. And on the other side, I would say that even though Khabib was able to drop McGregor, I would say Makhachev's got a better, well-rounded skill set when it comes to striking. Partly probably because he's had a knockout loss on his record and he had to kind of regroup and go back at it. I think it's a very, very evolved version of Khabib against McGregor. And I feel like McGregor's skills were so stacked in one end that it was, as soon as it kind of hit the floor, we were like, okay, well, we know how this is going to go. I don't have any kind of certainty about this fight when it hits the floor. I think it could go either way. I think Oliveira could be able to move him around and twist him up and challenge him with all different kinds of submission attacks. But I also think that Makhachev is going to be able to smash him into the floor with that shoulder pressure. And the stand-up is just as questionable for me as well. Like Conor, it was if it stays standing, Conor. If it goes to the ground, it's Khabib. I feel like this could be one either direction with either fighter.
Is it fair, in your opinion, to be making assumptions based on the track record and resume of each fighter? Because people have said, well, look at the opponents, the caliber of opponent that Islam has beaten. It's not on the level of Charles Oliveira, and it's not on the level of Charles Oliveira's recent opponents. How do you think that's fair, or is that kind of belittling how good Islam actually is?
I just think we're in a different stage of Islam's career. I think people are looking at where Islam's at and where Charles is at and trying to put them on an even footing and compare them that way. And they're just not. You know, what Charles Oliveira is, 33-8 is his record, and Makhachev's 22-1. Like Makhachev's first of all, had a very different relationship to the mixed martial arts game than Oliveira has. Oliveira was a welterweight in a tournament when he started as a pro. Then he was a lightweight for a bit, and then he went down to featherweight, and then he's back up to lightweight. He's missed weight, he's struggled, he's lost, he's been injured. He's been submitted. I mean, he's been guillotined a couple of times. Pettis and Lamas. He's been stopped, TKO. He's had a far more storied career than Makhachev, which arrives him at this fight in a different place. Makhachev is a supreme dominant competitor. We've seen him not get knocked out once, and we've seen him get dropped once by David Hamas. But even in the fights where he was wrestling against someone who was competitive, like Sarukian or Chris Wade, he was still able to get the better of them in the end. Like, he wins the majority of everything that he does. And Charles Oliveira, you can't necessarily say that. Poirier put him down, Gaethje put him down, Paul Felder TKO'd him, Pettis subbed him, Diego subbed, Lama subbed him. There are lots of different facets to each one of these careers. I don't think we can compare, his opponents versus his opponents, because Oliveira has been swimming in that shark tank and Makhachev's just jumped into the shark tank. Doesn't mean that he can't swim. It just means that we haven't seen him do it yet.
That's a fantastic analogy. I haven't heard it being put like that yet, but you can't really argue with that. I'm going to ask you a bit of a rogue one, Dan. Okay, so obviously Islam is being trained by Khabib for this fight. Khabib's in his corner. If Charles wins and maybe gets through maybe one other opponent, whoever that is next, do you think there's a possibility Khabib could come out of retirement, challenge Charles, and how would you see that fight going down?
Well, I mean, I would love to see it just as an MMA fan. I don't think we're going to get Khabib back in competition. I just think I think the time has passed now for him to even think about getting back into competition shape. Not that he's out of shape. I mean, he'd still beat the majority of guys on the UFC roster right now, no matter what weight class. But I think now he's investing all of his time into Makhachev. He's just taken on a different role in his life. And you also have to remember, aside from his last fight, Khabib was always the student and Abdul Manap was always the coach. And since he's lost his father, Khabib has the responsibility to step into that role. And I think he's done it so well. So in actuality, I think what he'll do is he'll spend more time invested in Makhachev and try and regroup and get the belt through Makhachev again. I don't think we'll see Khabib in there. And I honestly think that Khabib against Charles Oliveira is a very, very tough fight for Khabib. He's a tough fight for Makhachev. But I think that the skill set that Khabib's got, he doesn't have the same kind of. I don't think Khabib's got the same kind of variety in his game that Makhachev has now. I think Makhachev is the more evolved version of Khabib, and I think that we're going to see that in the next few fights. I think MMA's moved along, and I think Charles Oliveira has progressed the lightweight division in a way that Khabib was fortunate enough to avoid. If I'm honest, I think Khabib was great, but I think Charles Oliveira would have been his biggest test. And I think for Makhachev, we're going to see that.
Do you think Khabib is not the type of, because I'm guessing the sort of money that Dana would have to present to Khabib to entice him back would have to be astronomical. Is Khabib the kind of, he doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would be swayed by that.
No, that's the thing is, if ever there's something that brings somebody out of retirement, it's usually the numbers on the contract. And Khabib's just not that guy. I feel like he's got enough revenue sources and financial backers around him for whatever he decides to do. His brand is already strong enough. It would almost be an unnecessary risk for him to come back and risk that undefeated brand. I mean, you look at what's happened to McGregor's brand since he lost to Poirier. Like, it's almost better to ride off into the sunset with that mysticism of, well, he may just have been the best of all time, instead of coming back and maybe proving people that, there is someone better out there that can catch you. And Khabib must look at Charles Oliveira and think he is an incredible martial artist. Absolutely, he can see ways that he would beat him, but he could also see the depth of his skill set compared to some of the guys that Khabib fought when he was active.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's just one we'd want to, it's one of those historical matchups you just love to see, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You touched on, you mentioned in passing there the growth of MMA. I wanted to ask you, in the past few weeks in the world of boxing, we've seen fights like Anthony Joshua against Fury fall through, Crawford versus Spence fall through. That might take place next year. Then obviously Conor Benn failed a drugs test, so Benn versus Eubank Jr. fell through. How much of the UFC's growth and mixed martial arts growth do do you put down to boxing continually shooting itself in the foot?
It's really disappointing for me to see boxing going down this path, because, you know, I've been a boxing fan since I can remember, and there's no reason why we can't have these two sports thriving next to one another. The only reason why we've still got this comparison going on is because the way that they go about things is so different. Like, everybody in boxing is a superstar. Everyone's got a belt, and no one wants to fight somebody else with a belt. And the politics and the drama and the promoters trying to pull everything apart to get their piece, it makes the whole thing too political. And that's where the fans start to tune out. Now, the benefit is the majority of the best fighters in the world are all on the UFC roster, so the UFC can make whatever fights they want. The downside is that we're going to start getting that separation in MMA soon, when people realize the pay disparity. You know, like, we have the likes of PFL and Bellator and One Championship coming up and offering big paydays for people. And that's going to be enough to entice people out of the UFC roster, which will then fragment the sport. And you know full well that Dana's never going to do a collaboration with Scott Coker, and the UFC are never going to do a collaboration with One Championship. So we find ourselves in the same situation with boxing. The only reason why it's been slowed down is because everybody wants to be in the UFC and everyone wants to fight for the UFC brand. But money talks. And I think that eventually the UFC is going to have to start paying people more. Otherwise, the sport will fracture in itself, just like boxing did.
One final one from me on the point about Conor Benn. It's transpired that he's believed to have failed another drugs test for another fight earlier this year. How prevalent do you think PD use is in mixed martial arts or in combat sport in general, from your experience?
I mean, unfortunately, I think every sport is negatively affected by it in a big way. You know, I think especially after you've been around people that are using stuff and you can see how their body looks and how they move, and, you know, there are certain telltale signs. You can look through the UFC roster and go, he fails the eye test. And, you know, but the thing that the UFC have done really well is bringing in USADA, and it is incredibly intrusive. I mean, you know, Veronica's getting tested regularly and they're always banging on the door at weird hours of the day to test her. The good thing with that is it's a deterrent, because you can always get caught. You can always get caught. And the issue with the Conor Benn, Chris Eubank Jr. fight is that, I mean, what, they had 2 or 3 different testing parties and no one's exactly sure who's got authority. And that's again is the problem. There's no one overall holding the sport down. I mean, the British Boxing Board of Control didn't do enough to deal with that either. And that cast them in a bad light. I think the UFC, along with USADA, have done a really good job of deterring people from cheating, but people still will cheat as long as there's a benefit to be had. I think it's always going to be there. We've just got to do what we can to keep it out of combat sports. Because the reality is, if you throw in a javelin or you run 100 meters, I don't really care that much, because you're not going to damage anybody else in the process. But when you're using something like Conor Benn, and, you know, Chris Eubank was already talking about the weight discrepancy and how it was going to be dangerous, and then you add on a failed drug test on top of it, it just really it jades people when it comes to the sport, and it's disappointing.